This week on Break It to Make It.
The styles still work in one sense, which is when you are thinking about designing a course, think about different ways of presenting the content that give your learners options and choices, right? I'll use the term blended, but I don't mean instructor-led training and e-learning. What I mean is, gosh, if there's some content that you can present and somebody can read about it or they can listen to audio about it, and you can easily put both of those options into a training, why not do it?
Hello and welcome back to Break It to Make It, where we meet people who have thrown out the rule book, failed forwards, or taken the road less traveled to come out on top. Do any of these things sound familiar? You have a defined learning style. You only remember 10% of what you read. You only use 10 to 20% of your brain, and it takes a total of 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at anything. These and many other myths, yes, myths, are driving us to make poor decisions when it comes to how we are learning personally and how we might approach the training of others. In this episode, we're digging down and debunking a few of these common learning myths and looking at how they're impacting learning and training. We're also going to create time and space to discuss some better approaches. Friend of ours, friend of the show, friend of mine, has come to help us unpack it all, make sense of it, and help us chart a course to better outcomes. He has dedicated the last 20 years to developing new methods and models that upskill employees for peak performance. He's a reformed data scientist and currently serves as the L&D program manager for Microsoft Xbox Worldwide. Welcome to the show, Chuck Sigmund.
Thanks, Fallon. Great to be here. I really appreciate the invite.
Thank you. I'm so excited for this. And as I was entering it, one of my business partners is actually a learning and development specialist. And I said to her, you're not going to want to miss this episode because we're going to debunk some myths. And so she's really excited about that as well. Firstly, let's start with learning styles. Help orient us. Help jog the memory of our listeners. What are learning styles?
So learning styles are a myth that sort of gained traction back in the late 60s, early 70s. And they really became popular based on psychological and sociological assessments that were being done to try and identify how can we best educate our students. What was really interesting about this is it wasn't really driven by the educational world. It really was driven by the assessment world. And a variety of different companies came out with their assessments of what learning styles really existed and what kind of how we would approach teaching students in the best ways. And there are two models in particular that are most popular or probably most familiar to people. The first is what we call the VARK theory. This implies that there are four types of learners. And if you have kids who are even in elementary school, you may have heard of this, right? We have the visual learners, those who learn best by seeing maps, seeing pictures, those sorts of things. We have auditory listeners. They learn best by hearing things, the teacher talking to them, telling them the facts, telling them the information. We have reading listeners, those who get the most knowledge by looking at a book and going through that and being able to read and reread. And then, of course, we have kinetic listeners, those who like to try, test, put their hands and fingers on things. And, I think one of the reasons that people gravitate to that particular model is it sounds very easy. It sounds I can identify with it, right? There are things I do, like when I'm trying to learn a skill, maybe I like to try it, put my hands on it. When I'm coding computer language, for example, I want my hands on the keyboard to try and test that out. So that was one model. The other one that people may be familiar with is one that's called the preferred mode of perception, which really combines two different aspects of your learning. The first is your perception, whether you see things in concrete terms or abstract terms. And the second piece is how you process data. Are you actively experimenting, or do you like to reflect on things? Do you like to kind of watch from afar, observe, and then think about how you would incorporate that into your learning experience? And again, there are four models there. There are divergers, who are concrete thinkers who are very reflective. Then you have assimilators, who are abstract thinkers who are very reflective. Then you have convergers, who are abstract and active. And then finally, accommodators, who are very concrete thinkers and very active engagers, right? And as I said, it all sounds really good in theory and science, but maybe not so.
So you've talked about these two different models, and I'm nodding along going, yeah, I've definitely heard about that before. And while I'm listening, I'm also thinking, oh my gosh, I feel like I might be more than one thing. One feels very restrictive. Can you talk about how adhering to or boxing people in or making these assumptions can actually be harmful?
Sure. And let me back up just a little bit, because as I said, we're talking about myths here. And these two models have been around now for, we're talking 50 years. And there is no shortage of literature, even now in the educational space. You can go in and they will talk about learning styles. Fortunately, enough people are starting to realize, frankly, that it's bunk, and they're moving away from it. But it feels very, to your point, it feels very comfortable, right? I can say, oh, I'm kind of a visual learner, but I'm kind of a kinetic learner. What we know is that when you actually talk to learners, when you actually get into this, it's not about learning styles. It's about learning preferences. When we have seen that there has been tons of research and review of how this all started and how we got to where we are now, we see that scientists, actual educational scientists, have looked at the relationship between these assessments that box you into a particular learning style and your learning outcomes, show absolutely no correlation between the two.
Wow.
We go through this assessment and we say, Fallon is an auditory learner. So we develop an A/B test where we group all of these auditory learners and we randomly assign them to either a class that is specifically geared to teach to, quote, auditory learners, and we take another group of them that is not assigned that kind of treatment, and they just get the same content, but in a whole variety of methods. What we find is they do about the same in the two different classrooms. There is no difference in terms of their actual learning outcomes. Now, you may come out of it happier if you have one that sort of meets what you prefer to do, but that's how we are in anything in our lives, right? We gravitate towards those things that we like the best. But what's really important is recognizing that by saying you can only learn this way, well, what if there's no other way for you to learn it other than something different from how you've been identified as an auditory learner or a visual learner? We need to recognize that you have the capability of learning in all of these ways. It should not be a limiting factor for you.
That makes a lot of sense, and I can see our producers nodding along with this as well. And I think one of the things that I've heard from you here is you're not boxed in to being able to learn a certain way. Humans are incredibly adaptable and complex creatures, and we can learn in the face of any sort of stimulus. I mean, it's just in our nature. The real defining thing is how good we feel about it. And that's expressed through our preference. And so when I think a logical extension for this and where my brain is going is if we think about your career, learning and development, right? We sometimes test the learning outcomes, but more often than not, we ask, how satisfied were you? How satisfied were you with this?
that lovely L1 smile sheet at the end of the day.
Exactly. So we're asking, that's the smile sheet. And that's really about how people feel about it. It's maybe not testing what did they learn out of it. Can you talk a little bit about how we measure this, and as a professional, what impact that has by pivoting and focusing on people's preferences rather than potentially testing the outcomes? Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, let me give you a little statistics from a piece of research that was done probably 15 years ago now, 10, 15 years ago now, and then we can talk about that a little. There was a study done by Polly Hussman and Valerie O'Loughlin, which I like to trumpet everywhere I go. They went and looked at university students, and there was a study done, a controlled study done, where they allowed students who had taken one of these assessments and identified themselves as this kind of learner to put themselves in a course that was specifically titled or specifically identified as meeting that sort of learner goal. So people, obviously they moved into courses that matched their preferred learning style. They said, oh, I'm a visual learner. This course says it is going to focus on using lots of art, lots of pictures, etc. And they self-selected into those. What they found, this is really fascinating, is even though you are a visual learner, they observed these students. 2/3 of the students did not study in a way that was consistent with the learning style that they were identified as. So even though you were identified as a visual learner, we put you in a class that was for visual learners. When it actually came time for you to study for that class, that's not what you did. You might listen to something, you might read a book, you might put your hands on something. 2/3 of students went completely against what their defined learning style was. And I know I use air quotes a lot for this one because I really have a challenge with this. And most importantly, at the end of the day, those students did just as well. Those who did not study the same way their learning preference was, did just as well in those classes as students who did. So it all comes down to what actually works for me for a given topic, for a given course, right? And that gets me to the best outcomes. And what we see is that students mix learning styles, right? You may have a visual learning preference, and you get into class and say, for this particular topic, what really would work for me is to listen to some lecture about this, right? We see this, for example, in an art class. If you go to an art museum, what do? Well, part of what you do is you look at the art, but in most museums, you also can get those headphones where you go around and you learn about the art, right? So you're getting all of the information in multiple ways. And when we think about training in a corporate environment, it's the same thing. I train within the Xbox environment. I have about 2,000 learners that I'm responsible for. I cannot say, okay, because they're all gamers, right? They play Xbox. I'm only going to give them tactile experiences. I'm only going to give them kinetic experiences. We have to give them opportunities to practice, to train, to learn across all of these different dimensions and let them kind of choose what works best for them.
That makes sense. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about things like, sure, I may have a preference, but what if that input isn't available? I have a desired outcome. I'm here to learn. I need to learn something. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take what I'm given and do the best with what I have and supplement it in whichever way that I can. And then if I put on my learning and development hat, budgets don't always allow for production of multiple different formats and all of those types of things. It's very difficult because we always have constraints, both as, I'm just going to oversimplify here, as teachers and as learners. But if this is an absolute myth, there are people questioning right now. I can hear their jaws just dropping. People questioning their whole life's work. If we need to throw this out, if we need to think about things differently, is there a specific means of learning/training that you would recommend in place of using these styles as a crutch?
Yeah, so I think the styles still work in one sense, which is when you are thinking about designing a course, think about different ways of presenting the content that give your learners options and choices, right? I'll use the term blended, but I don't mean instructor-led training and e-learning. What I mean is, gosh, if there's some content that you can present and somebody can read about it or they can listen to audio about it, and you can easily put both of those options into a training, why not do it, right? Give people the ability to make that choice and to have that individual capability of going through the material in a way that they feel makes most sense for them. Having that personal autonomy, I think, really helps. It helps in two ways. First of all, it helps mentally to allow them to route themselves through the training in a way that works best. Second, I think that autonomy and giving them choice engages them in the material in a way that just presenting the content doesn't, right? They feel more invested in, oh, I made this decision to learn this way, so I'm going to sort of take hold of it more than if somebody forced me. We've all seen the e-learning courses where it's essentially a PowerPoint with an X button, right? First of all, very few people would choose that as their option for learning how to do things. But if that was one option, and then maybe listening to an audio, a podcast, for example, maybe that's another option for the same content, being able to make that decision for myself gets me invested in the content.
I love that. And I like to try and oversimplify things so that I can absorb them. And one of the key messages that I want to take away from this first part of our interview today is that humans have a preference. The human preference changes. And in order for people to feel empowered, they need to be able to exercise a preference, which means that we need to provide them with choice. And the act of making a choice inherently means that we're more invested in it. It's something Absolutely. That we're doing rather than having something done to us. And so super exciting and interesting from that perspective. That's wonderful. Now, let's switch gears a little bit. Is it true that 10,000 hours of practice makes you an expert?
So, Fallon, that's all about definition. That came from some work that was done by Malcolm Gladwell a couple of years ago, where he came out and said 10,000 hours of practice of a skill will make you an expert in that skill. And that's kind of where people stop. They hear that little pithy quote and they move on from that and say, Fallon, if you spend 10,000 hours doing anything, you're going to be the world's greatest expert at it. What they miss in that is that even Gladwell has talked over and over about this, is that it's not just 10,000 hours. It's 10,000 hours of very consistent practice and what he calls deliberate practice. So what that means is you have an outcome you're trying to achieve. I want to be an expert at golf, right? I want to be able to play in the PGA Tour, whatever that is. And I'm going to have clearly defined milestones and goals all along the way in that 10,000 hours to get to that ultimate goal of playing in the PGA. So I have to have a really clear objective in mind in the long run. I have to have what I call these one of my colleagues, Tino Simon, talks about teaching skill-based learning. You have to do the thing, right? For me, this 10,000 hours is not just about doing the thing, being in the PGA. It's about doing all of the sub things as well. Well, I've got to spend lots of hours learning how to putt. I've got to spend hours learning how to drive the ball, all of that. All of those sub things that make up your eventual expertise. The last part of Gladwell's theory, which I think is most important and that people completely ignore, is there has to be immediate feedback, right? I do something, I do a thing, or I do a sub thing. How did I do? Have somebody give me feedback. Did I do it right? Did I do it wrong? What parts do I need to improve on? All of that gets us to being able to do the thing better, and eventually, after 10,000 hours or some amount, be an expert.
That's fantastic. And I love that you've provided that broader context. I'm a huge Malcolm Gladwell fan. Actually, shout out to his podcast, Revisionist History. If you haven't made time for it, 5 stars, highly recommend. So let's now transition to the final part and piece, and I'm really excited for this. Who is Edgar Dale?
Edgar Dale. So we've probably in the educational world, if you're an educator, whether you're a corporate trainer, you're a teacher in a K through 12 school, you've probably heard the 70-20-10 rule, right? The quote is that people generally remember 10% of what they've read, 20% of what they see, and 70% of what they say and write. Well, it's hilarious that this is attributed to Edgar Dale, who was an educational philosopher. In fact, he's still alive. I think he's in his late 80s now. Dr. Dale worked at Eastman Kodak back in his early career. And that really kind of formed some of his thinking around learning and development and how people experience and apply concepts. And he came up with this really great idea called the cone of learning. And the cone of learning, it looks like a pyramid, right? And at the bottom of the pyramid are experiential ways of learning things or interacting with things that can be seen, tasted, that sort of thing. At the top, it's all about things that are highly abstract, verbal representations of things and pictorial representations of things. So, for example, there's a great quote about some of his work where at the bottom of that cone, you think about a horse and you have an experience with a horse. You get on a horse, you feel a horse, you ride a horse, right? So you have this experiential learning about a horse. At the top of this cone is the verbal symbols, the word horse. Well, that if you've never met a horse, if you've never seen a horse, the word horse means absolutely nothing to you. It's a very abstract concept, right? So it's how do we take our experiential learning and eventually get it to an abstract where we can apply it and maybe even bring it into other pieces. What's really hilarious is that this cone, as I said, has no numbers attached to it. He basically just kind of layered this cone of learning and said, here's the experiential piece. And as you go up, eventually you'll learn more and you'll be able to abstract those things you've experienced and you'll be able to apply them. Well, at some point, someone, and I don't know that anybody's ever been able to nail down who exactly the person was. You know, when Edgar Dale put this picture out, it was just a picture. And, you know, when you draw a pyramid, you have little slices of the pyramid. Well, somebody said, well, okay, you know, these two bottom slices, if I add them together, they make up 10% of the cone. And if I add these middle ones, they make up 20% of the cone. And these other ones, they make up 70%. It was some mathematical estimation. And Edgar Dale has come out and said that the cone was made up that way because that's how my drawing tool was able to make it up and make it readable, right? This 70-20-10 model really had no numbers attached to it. And he would tell you that none of that really applies to how he was thinking about it. For him, it was purely a theoretical model.
That makes sense and is so fascinating, but a really good lesson in how it's people's perception or people's interpretation of things. You know, we talk about stuff all the time in terms of communication and learning. There's so much communication goes into it. You know, my intention in encoding the message or preparing a visual representation, it might be one thing, but there's no guarantee that you or anybody else is going to decode it in that same way. And once we release information and it starts to be absorbed by somebody else, it becomes theirs. And then they do with it what they will. And so this poor guy, the cat's out of the bag. He's drawn a cone. Somebody's eyeballed it and gone, I know math. I know area. That picture takes up about 70%. That part takes up about 10. That part takes about 20. And it's way easier for me to describe it in these big round numbers. I just find it's so fascinating. Why do you think that we've adopted this and these other myths and all the ones that we haven't had time for today? What is it about us as humans that has us adopt these things as being true, even though there is clear evidence that disproves them? The people who say these things and that have been then misinterpreted, they come out in argument against it. But why do we persist? Why do the myths endure?
So I think two reasons. The first is they tend to be pithy quotes that are really easy to remember and regurgitate, right? The 70-20-10 model. How many times have I gone to an L&D conference and heard people talk about the 70-20-10 model or the 4 learner styles? I mean, I was at a conference last week and I heard somebody talking about learning styles while I was in the audience, and all I could do was shake my head, right? And there were people at the table going, "Oh, not that again." But it's easy, right? I heard it at a conference. It must be so because I heard it from this person who's an expert in this field. Now I'm going to go and share it with my colleagues, etc. I think the second piece, and this is the part where it becomes most dangerous, is we use it as L&D professionals to sound like we know what we're talking about and to gain a certain level of, I'll call it street cred, right? Gosh, if I say the same things that all these experts are saying, I must really know what I'm talking about. I must be an expert. And if I say it enough times with enough confidence, then boy, am I an expert. And now people will have to listen because I act like I know what I'm talking about. And I don't mean to, I'm not trying to shame my colleagues who say some of these things, but it becomes easy to do. And I think we need to get past the easy sometimes.
That makes so much sense. And we had a similar conversation with some of our other guests, but it's part of the human condition, right? We want to belong. Everybody wants to belong. If I feel like I'm a duck, I'm going to walk like a duck, I'm going to quack like a duck because I want to be accepted as a duck, even if I think a little bit differently. And so that's a really nice point. And I think one that has me reflecting as well on my choices. Before we close, what's the one thing that you hope our listeners take away from our conversation today?
So I think sort of feeding off of what you just said, I would say challenge yourself to not be a duck. Be willing to say when somebody steps up and says a number, especially when you hear numbers and they are round, 70, 20, 10. Boy, those are round numbers. You sure it's not 76, 21 and whatever, right? Challenge those. Don't necessarily challenge the person, but go and do your research. Say, where did that come from? Who came up with that? Why did they come up with that? In what circumstances does that apply? And that last question to me is the most critical. We hear these things all the time. And, we talked about the 10,000 hours of becoming an expert. And there are places where that does indeed apply, but there are some other places where not only does it not apply, we know that there's evidence that says people not only don't get better with more practice, in some cases they get worse. So really dig into, gosh, I heard this thing. It sounds enticing. It sounds like something I should be thinking about using, applying, whatever. Let me kind of figure out where that came from and whether that makes sense for me.
I love that. That's this idea of staying curious, trust, but verify. If you're interested enough in something to absorb that pithy little piece of information, why not go investigate a little bit and make sure that you can answer what I would refer to as the 2-question test. Could you get 2 questions deep into a conversation around this particular thing? That is fantastic advice and a great takeaway. I could spend forever with you because I just learn so much from you every single time that we talk. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your big, beautiful brain with us. I'm looking forward to our next conversation. For anybody who is listening, if you want to learn more about Chuck, learn more from Chuck, head over to LinkedIn, check him out, take an opportunity to connect and get more friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you back every Monday here at Break It to Make It. Have a beautiful day.